We did Vayetze, we did Don, and Vayishlach we did Naphtali, and since then we had Vayeshem, Meketz, Vigish, Vayechi. Each week we had another reason why we didn't have a class. One or two was Chanukah, one was Nittel, and one was I was in England. So the Shvatim are going to wait till next year. The Shvatim is a big piece of work. It's a lot of work. And last year I did 6. You see, we did 2. Next year we'll do Mitchem, 4 more. Unless something gets in the way again. So we're doing Parshas Shmos. Parshas Shmos is the beginning of the Golus. As we all know, the Jewish exile has 3 basic stages. The first stage of the Jewish exile is from the time Yitzchak is born. Because according to Rashi and many of the Chazal, the 400 years of Golus Mitzrayim starts from the birth of Yitzchak. So from the time Yitzchak is born, it's not anymore free. The second is when the family of Yaakov Avinu goes to Mitzrayim. Yaakov is 130 years old. Yaakov is 130 years old. And the third is when Yosef and all of his brothers pass away, and Parei, quote, forgets how much Yosef and the family of Yosef HaTzadik had done for Egypt, and he turns on the Jewish people, right? And they create a whole scheme to incarcerate, to enslave the Jewish people. We all know the story. Those are 3 stages in Golus. The first stage in Golus is during the time of the Avos. The second stage, from Yitzchak's birth, the second stage of the Golus is from the time Yaakov and his children come to Mitzrayim. And the third stage of Golus, from the last of Yosef's brothers, his name is Levi, passes away, the Golus starts in earnest. Now, according to the Sifsei Chachamim and other Sfarim, from the time Levi died till Yidden left Egypt, it's 116 years. They were in Egypt 210 out of 400, which means there's 190 years from the birth of Yitzchak until they come to Mitzrayim. There's 210 years in Egypt. Of those 210 years, so 94 of them were good, were nice. 116 were not so pleasant. But of those 116 itself, you have to divide it into 2. The first 30 and the last 86. The way the story played out was the Pharaoh announced public works. The Egyptian king announced public works. In other words, that they were going to do things for the country. And they said, we need volunteers. People should come and participate in these public works as volunteers. The government is making projects. Everybody should give a little time. So the Bnei Yaakov said, okay, we'll give time also. What they didn't realize was that there was a plan to create a system where slowly but surely the Yidden would put in positions of subordination, secondary positions, and then once the Yidden were accustomed to being subordinate, then they would enslave them. That took 30 years, which is a generation and a half. During this time, Parei himself picked up an easel and started to make bricks. And slowly but surely they positioned the Yidden into position of subordination, and then the year Miriam is born. Miriam was 86 years old when they left Egypt. Her name, Miriam, means mar, bitter. When she was born, so Yechavet saw Baruch Kodsha, but Nevuah, what was coming, she named her daughter not based on what had been, but was happening, what's going to happen. The Golus was going to become terribly severe. And for the next 86 years, the Jewish people suffered the worst kind of exile. I'm imagining, when you read the Sfarim about this, imagine living in Auschwitz for 86 years. They gave you starvation diets. They worked you to death. That was the plan. But instead of Yidden dying, they kept multiplying. They kept having babies. And the more the Egyptians starved the Jews, the more babies they had. It was a fantastic miracle. It went on for 17 times as many years Yidden suffered in those terrible camps. And they survived. They became out in great numbers. But they were shattered as a people. And when we left Mitzrayim, they had to basically rehabilitate us, make us from scratch. And we became the nation of the Eibishter. The nation of God. This is the story in very brief words, and I would agree that some people would say that some of the things I just said was a little bit of a conjecture, a little bit of a spin, but this is how I understand this story. The Holocaust is worse because they gassed them. But the people that they put to work, the slavery, was the same kind of a condition. They were supposed to work them to death.
More people died
and they wouldn't die. They wouldn't die. In Mitzrayim, was a nest. They had babies under those conditions. Okay, I'm not talking numbers. I'm talking about the quality of the slavery. and I don't want to have the discussion now. It's a discussion for a different time. If this class was on Vayamaros Chayim, I would engage. I'm just setting a stage. We're beginning Sefer Shmos. And of course, a critical principle in the story is Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu comes up in the story. Now, when you read the birth of Moshe Rabbeinu, you need to understand something foundational about the whole Chumash. And when I say Chumash, I mean all 5 books. Bereshis, Shmos, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim. You had a bar mitzvah, and you chazed a bar mitzvah maimer. And you learned in the bar mitzvah maimer that Alpayim Shana Kodma Torah, the Torah came before the world. The Torah existed before the world. Now when you read the Torah, you read a history book about individual people at particular times who engaged in certain things and so forth and so on. And of course there's a lot of ways of resolving this question. How could the Torah be 2,000 years before the world if the Torah tells stories about people who lived? There's all kinds of explanations. And one of the simple explanations is that the Torah came before the world, but it was delivered in time. Hashem's Torah, written before the world, was delivered in time, meaning even the stories, the lessons that the stories teach are connected to individual people, but it reveals a wisdom which is from before the world. And one of the things that you have about Tanakh is that there are certain Sfarim that speak to individual people. Certain books of the Tanakh they speak to individual people. Like the Sefer Divrei Hayamim speaks to the family of David HaMelech, the family of David. Sefer Shmuel speaks about Shmuel, even though much of it's about after Shmuel passes away. There are certain books in Tanakh that speak to individuals. The Chamishei Chumshei Torah are Torah's Moshe. The 5 books are Moshe's books, even though in the whole first Sefer Bereshis he doesn't appear once. If you look at the Chumash beginning to the end, and you realize that the first Sefer deals with 2,400 years, and the other 4 books deal with 120 years, right? From Shmos, so that's about 120 years. From Moshe Rabbeinu's birth to Moshe Rabbeinu's death, you understand that although Sefer Bereshis is not by Moshe Rabbeinu, the Chamisha Chomshei Torah, which were written before the creation, come into the world as connection to a man, Moshe. The Torah is Moshe Rabbeinu's Sefer, including Bereshis. That's why Moshe is so important. We talk about his birth, we talk about his nursing, we talk about his growing up. We don't just talk about his teaching, we talk about his life, because the Chumash is the book of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's a Sefer of Moshe Rabbeinu. And of course, the way the story plays out, Moshe doesn't suffer. And it says in Likutei Sichos that in order for Moshe to be a redeemer, he had to be outside of the Golus. Moshe runs off, he spends 80 years or so, whatever, 65 years, whatever number of years it was, away from Egypt. According to certain Medrashim, he was a king in Ethiopia for 40 years. And he re-emerges at the age of 80 after being a king in Ethiopia for 40 years and finding Tzipora, Midian, and the whole story with Yisrael, the different Medrashim. And finally Hashem comes to Moshe and says, okay, it's time, go back to Mitzrayim, take your brothers out. And of course Moshe Rabbeinu's response, of course, was, me? I've lived on the Hag, I've had such a great life, I never suffered a day in my life. My brother and sister, they suffered the Jewish people for 80 years, they should redeem the Jewish people. And Hashem says to Moshe, no, you were destined to take Jewish people out of the Zion, but to give them the Torah. Moshe, it's so unfair. They suffered with the Jewish people for 80 years. And here I'm going to come, this hero comes out of the wilderness, and I'm the Redeemer. And Hashem tells Moshe, don't worry, your brother's going to be happy to have you at the job. Your brother's going to come out again, so we'll let you happy to have the job. And of course, Moshe comes back, and the rest is history. Of course, only Moshe left, as was Miriam. I can't hear you.
No one else could leave.
Okay, that's a different detail. Fine. How did Moshe get out? But there's a turning point in the story. The turning point in the story actually starts before Hashem speaks to Moshe. Understand, Moshe was born and immediately put in the palace. He grew up in the palace as Pari's favorite grandson. And as soon as he turns 15 or whatever, 13 or 15, he goes out into the streets, and he so identifies with the Jews, it's amazing. He is raised in the Pharaoh's palace as the Pharaoh's grandson, but he never ever loses his identity as a member of the Jewish people are being enslaved. The first day he leaves the palace, he's sticking up for the Jews, he kills the Mitzri, and with 2 or 3 days, his beloved grandfather wants to behead him. Literally, took 2 days. For 15 years he raises him as his own son, and then boom, overnight he's killing him because he killed a mitzvah. Moshe has to run away. And Moshe disappears, and like I said, there's 65 years of Moshe's life unaccounted for. And there's a sefer, it's an ancient medrash, it's considered a reliable medrash called Sefer HaYashar, that says Moshe went into Africa. Egypt is Africa. He went south, East Africa. Underneath Egypt is Ethiopia. He served as a king there for 40 years. And the reason he left was because they wanted him to marry. And they wanted to marry an African princess, and Moshe wouldn't marry an African princess. That's why he left. Because they were forcing him. A king has to be married. For 40 years, he served as a king, as a bachelor, and they pressed him to become to get married. He left. And he goes to Midian, and again, there's different midrashim. Midian, Yossi throws him in a pit for many years, and he's not feeding him, and Tzipora feeds him, so he survives. After I think 14 years in the pit, he's still alive. Yossi said the guy can live without food. Maybe he's a miracle worker, schleps him out, and that's the rest. And Moshe marries Tzipora, and they have 2 children. They're going back to Mitzrayim, and Aaron tells Moshe, out of your mind, you know what's going on in Mitzrayim, send them back. But the story does not start with Moshe HaYarayeh. The story, the transitional moment from the darkness of the Golus to the beginning of the redemption doesn't begin when Moshe meets Hashem at the burning bush. It starts 2 psukim before, or 3 psukim before. And I want to read you those 3 psukim because that, at least in part, is tonight's class. Moshe disappears, he's gone for a very long time, and the Golus is getting worse and worse and worse. Of course, we know that it never gets as bad as when Moshe comes back and tries to fix it, right? The worst thing that ever happens is Moshe comes and tries to make it better, and then the Pharaoh makes it impossibly bad when he doesn't even give them straw. But the turning point in the story, from a perspective of religion, is not when Hashem speaks to Moshe, it's when Hashem decides to speak to Moshe. And I read, it was as the passage of many days it came. The king of Egypt dies. The Jewish people cry out, they sigh min ha'avodah from their work. They scream. Their cries went up to Elikim, to the Eibishter, min ha'avodah from their work. And then it says, Vayishma lekim es na'akosam. Hashem hears their anguish, their suffering, their crying. Vayisker lekim es berise. Lekim remembers the covenant that he made with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And then it says, Vayara lekim es bnei Yisrael. Lekim saw the Jewish people. Vayeda lekim, and the Eibishter knew. 3 psukim. The king of Egypt dies, which actually became a Mitzvah, and he decided that he has to bathe in the blood of infants, and he would take Jewish babies and kill them and use the blood for a bath. That was mad. And this is when the Jewish people are crying. And then it says, Hashem heard, and Hashem remembered, and Hashem saw, and Hashem knew. Now, what the story is saying is that one day Hashem said, okay, it's enough, right? It's like the Megillah. The Megillah says that Haman comes along and Achashverosh makes him powerful. Mordechai refuses to bow. Haman decides he's killing all the Jewish people. We all know that story. And Esther panics, and Mordechai panics, and Esther panics. What's the turning point in the story? One day the Eibishter wakes up. We know what the Chazal says, the Gemara says, that every time it says in the Megillah HaMelech, it means the Eibishter. And on that night, the king, the Eibishter's sleep was stirred, and the story of Purim turns. But they're exactly the same. The Jews are suffering for 86 years, and one day, the Eibishter notices. He hears their cries, he hears, he remembers, he sees, and he knows. 4 expressions. And the Rakanti, which is the Sefer of Kabbalah, points out, it says 4 times Shem Elokim. Vayishma Elokim, Vayisker Elokim, Vayara Elokim, Vayeda Elokim. Any person who has any belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu believes that the Eibishter knows everything. So exactly what does it mean? Yidden are suffering for 86 years, and one day the Eibishter wakes up. And we'll be till now geschlafen. Well, you learn the Megillah. But Lailahu, Noded Ashnas HaMelech, the king's sleep is stirred. So every sefer that's beyond Pshat, he immediately jumps and says, wait a minute. The Eibishter woke up, he's sleeping till now. And there has to be a deeper meaning to the Eibishter's sleep. So there has to be a deeper meaning to these few psukim. Jews have suffered a gefelliche Golus for 86 years, and then one day they cry, and the Eibishter hears and remembers and sees and knows. Vayishma, Vayizked, Vayad, Vayeda. Each one goes with a different Shem Elokim. So the question that we have is, young man, please close the door. Appreciate it. Thank you. The question that we have is, in Lashon HaGemara, Mikara Ma'ikasova L'B'Seif Ma'ikasova, is God God or not? If he knows, he always knew. And if he didn't know, what did he find out? It's a classic question. It's a classic question. And technically, our class is on the last of these psukim, which is Kapitel Beis Pasuk Chof Hei. Vayada Elokim es Bnei Yisrael. Elokim saw the sons of Israel. Vayeda Elokim, and the Eibishter knew. And I'm bringing you a series of different interpretations of this. I have some notes here that I wrote. But in a broader sense, we're going in all three psukim. Where was the Eibishter till now? We didn't know. And of course, there's different Mefarshim who answer this question. When you learn Torah, there's Pshat, there's Remez, and there's Rush and the Seid. On a Pshat question, we don't wonder, what does it mean? Hashem didn't know yesterday, now he knows. Yesterday, now he knows. He decided to know. That's all. As Rashi says, what does Rashi say? He decided to pay attention. Until now, he made believe he doesn't know. And from now, he decided that he knows. So there's a simpler pshat that doesn't get into the theology so deeply. What does it mean he didn't know? What does it mean he did know? He was acting like he didn't know, and now he's making believe he knows. That's the pshat, right? He didn't know, and then he knew. And there's some very simple ideas about this. Vayad Elokim es Bnei Yisrael v'yed Elokim. The Medrash says he saw their suffering. He saw how much they suffered. He saw their suffering. He saw Vayad Elokim es Onyam, their torture, their oppression. Vayeda Machayvav, he knew their physical pain, and he decided, okay, it's enough. The Even Ezer has a very interesting pshetel, and I wonder how you reconcile the Even Ezer with other Mefarshim. He says, Vayar, Hashem saw what Mitzrayim was doing to the Jewish people in public. Vayeda, and he knew what Mitzrayim was doing to the Jewish people in private. Meaning, even a slave who has a master, and his master is a Rosh Hamerush, his master is a miserable person, and his master is cruel. But the master knows that there are other masters. And the other masters sort of have a certain level of you don't beat up your slaves unnecessarily and cruelly. But there's what you'll do to your slave in public. And based on what you do to your slave in public, you can have an idea of what you're doing to your slave when no one's watching. So Even Ezer titles Vayar Elokim as Bnei Yisrael. Elokim saw what Egypt was doing to the Jewish people in the street. Vayeda, and he deduced what they're doing to the Jewish people in private. Meaning, not the pshat the Eibishter didn't know. It's the pshat that this pasuk is articulating the degree of Egyptian cruelty. If Egypt was able to be so overtly cruel to the Jews in the street, you can imagine the cruelty they did in private was even far, far worse. And by the way, you mentioned the Nazis, and it's a pretty good corollary. I mean, the thing about the Nazis, which is so unbelievably powerful, is the Nazis created cruel people, evil people. And you were considered a better Nazi if you knew how to be more cruel. And they literally treated the Jews like you treat an infestation of mice. If a person has a rat problem, or a mice problem, or a cockroach problem, and he puts out traps, and he catches a mouse, and he throws them in the garbage, he's not angry at the mouse. He doesn't feel bad for the mouse. Let's get rid of his mice. The attitude that they had towards the Jews was they have to dispose of them, get rid of them. That was one level. But then there was a level of enjoying watching Yidden suffer. That wasn't part of their job. Their job was to exterminate the Jews. And that's Vayar Vayeda. This is what you're supposed to do, and then this is what they did. And the pasuk, the way that Even Ezer is explaining it, is articulating not that the Eibishter didn't know and then he found out. It's Eibishter by identifying what they were doing in the street, in public. You can only imagine how cruel they were when they were in private, which expresses the extreme to which the Egyptians went in the cruelty to the Jewish people. I want you to know that there's a famous Rambam, it's a very, very famous Rambam, who asks the question, didn't Hashem say that the Egyptians were going to enslave the Jews? It doesn't Chumash. Hashem told Avraham Avinu, children are going to be enslaved. If Hashem told Avraham Avinu you're going to be enslaved, why is he punishing Egypt for enslaving the Jews? He said it was going to happen. So the Rambam asks this question in the laws of free will. If the Egyptians had free will, why? If the Eibishter said they were going to enslave the Jews, they didn't have free will. So why were they being punished? If they had free will, how was the Eibishter sure that they were going to actually punish the Jewish people? And the Rambam gives a complicated answer that I've argued. It becomes a whole song and dance. But one of the explanations is simply Hashem expected Egypt to enslave the Jews, but did not expect them to enslave them as cruelly as they did. And they were not punished for enslaving the Jews, they were punished for enjoying it. And adding a level of cruelty on top of a level of cruelty, top of a level of cruelty, and that's how the Even Eder translates this pasuk. Vayar vayeda. Rashi says, and the Sipparus says a similar thing, that the issue was not that Hashem didn't know until now. The issue was that there is a concept of Hester Ponim. We know this from all over Torah. That sometimes the Eibishter makes himself like as if he doesn't see. In Parshas B'chukaisai, in the Parshas Kisavai, I talked about it in the class recently, there's a concept of Keri. When you act like there's no God, God acts like there's no God. When we behave in a way that's not consistent with the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem allows the world to appear as there's no Hashgacha Pratis. There's still a Hashgacha, but it looks random. This is called Hester Panim. Hashem relates to the world in a kind of way that you don't see him. And when Yidden were in Golus, B'chlal, that's the trademark of Golus. The trademark of Golus is that Hashem is hiding himself. When Yidden were in Golus, the Eibishter was hiding. And that hiding played itself out in the Tzoros. Hashem allowed these terrible things to happen. And on a higher level, there's Hashgacha Pratis. But you don't see the hand of God. You see what appears to be an entirely random way of life. You don't see the Eibishter Faket. You see just people doing whatever they want, and there's lays din, lays dying. There's nobody in charge of the world. And then, at a certain point, and we're going to say that this was when Miriam turned about 85 or 86, Vayar vayeda, the Eibishter says, okay, I'm not sleeping anymore. Until now, as the Pashna Pasuk says, I was Maile Mayan. I looked away, I allowed this Golus to happen, but you have to remember, Golus Mitzrayim is different than later Golus. Golus Mitzrayim was not a punishment. Later Golus were a punishment. We did Averis, they got punished. Golus was not we didn't do anything wrong. Golus Mitzrayim was the prerequisite to the birth of the Jewish nation as a people and the giving of the Torah. Golus Mitzrayim happened to Yidden that didn't deserve Golus. They were tzaddikim, they were the Shvatim. They didn't go into Golus because they're Averis, they went to Golus because we need to clean them and ready them for each. So part of that process was the Eibishter makes believe he doesn't see. You watch your kid suffer and you keep quiet. And you eat your heart out, and you don't say a word because it needs to go through it. And then one day Abby says, okay, Yossi went through it. Vayeda, vayar vayeda. Now I'm going to pay attention, and I'm going to tune into the Jewish people, and from now going forward, there's going to be an overt Hashgacha Pratis. What's happening in the lives of the Jewish people and their suffering is going to start to make sense. A Yid suffers, a Goy pays. Until now, there was this Hester Panim, Hashem made believers know what's going on, and it's like a turning point in the story. And the turning point in the story, so to speak, happening in the Eibishter's head. Variyada Lekim as B'nei Yisrael. He's been watching the whole time. But until now, he was behaving as if he doesn't see. Now he says, I'm going to pay attention. And there's going to begin to be an order in the world where if a person is suffering and he's underprivileged and somebody else taking advantage of him, the Eibishter is going to return it. You know, the mighty fall and the lowly rise is going to become an order to the Eibishter's world. Vayeda, the Eibishter knew what needed to happen to get the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. That's another pshat. But then you have weird pshatim. Yeah? It comes time to go out, you take it into Mitzrayim. And the Eibishter wakes up. For 86 years he's been making believe he doesn't see. And one day, okay, it's enough. Just like in the Megillah. But the Eibishter has been watching the whole time and making believe he sleeps, says, I'm not sleeping anymore. The same idea happens in Yetzias Mitzrayim. And the Pasuk says, Vayishma Elokim es na'akosam, Vayishma he heard, Vayuske he remembered, Vayar he saw, Vayar he knew, says in Medrash. Vayar he saw that the future is that the Jewish people are going to rebel against the Eibishter time and time again. Vayedan he knew that the Jewish people were going to rebel against the Eibishter time and time again. He said, I'm redeeming him anyway. There's such a medrash. The Eibishter saw that from Yidden he's going to have gahak tetzaras. He's going to create a nation of God. They're going to question him at every turn. Every time the Jewish people become a little bit comfortable, they become very, very self-reliant. They forget about the Eibishter, and the cycle repeats itself. The Eibishter saw that the Yidden were going to rise up against him time and time again. He said, I'm taking them out anyway. And the Medrash says, why? Why are you taking Yidden out of Golus? If you see and you know that tomorrow, that means in 100 years, and in 500 years, and 1,000 years, and in 3,000 years, every time the Jewish people find this a little bit better situation, they're going to not listen to the Eibishter. The answer is, so he says, L'man Shmoi, for the sake of Hashem's name. That's how he touched it. That's such a Medrash. Vayad, the Eibishter saw the Yidden not going to be tzaddikim always. Vayed, the Eibishter knew the Yidden not going to be taken about anyway. L'man Shmoi. Now there's a lot of ways of understanding this, but my interpretation is that the Eibishter's plan is what you would call big picture. Big picture. The big picture is, I'm creating a nation of Jews, and believe it or not, he's giving us free will. And free will is a mix of a curse and a blessing. I mean, is free will the greatest thing we have or the worst thing we have? And the answer is probably both. And because of this free will, we're going to show ourselves to be amazing on occasions. We're also going to show ourselves to be amazingly corrupt on other occasions. But it's a long-term plan. The long-term plan is that this world is going to be God's. The name of Hashem is going to fill this earth. And the Eibishter knows that the Yidden are going to give him a very, very hard time. That the Yidden are going to be in and out of service. They're going to be good and bad intermittently. But he knows two things. Number one, the end game is that the name of Hashem is going to be revealed in the world. And number two, nobody else could do it except these chaleres. Chaleres means no lives, no good nicks. Vayad, he sees Yidden are going to rebel against Hashem 1,000 times. Vayed, he knows. And he says, no, I'm taking them out of Mitzrayim. Because these guys who are going to rebel against the Eibush and return, in the end, are the only ones who are able to bring home the purpose that the Eibish's name should fill the world. Like you have in Chumash Rashi, as you all know. Hashem is angry at the Jewish people. What does he say? They're a nation of a hard neck. Moshe is trying to get the Eibush to forgive the Jewish people. What does he say? A nation of a hard neck. The same argument to kill the Jews, the same argument to give to Jews. Moshe says to the Eibush, you think under a hard neck, but that hard neck is where they're going to survive. There, Vayar, what is this Lashon? Shasidim lahachis, Vayedidim liberates, Velinates, he brings Midrash. Jews are going to do everything imaginable wrong against this Eibishter, who's giving birth to them as a people. He's giving them his Torah, he's making them his people. I'm doing it anyway. Why? Maybe it's another nation. Sweet, nice chevra, they'll never rebel, never make trouble. But the first time life gets tough, they're gone. The Eibishter sees Yidden, and he knows how troublesome they're going to be to him. He says, no, this is the guys. Vayed, that's the pshat. He sees how much tzaras Yidden are going to make. Vayed, he knows how much tzaras Yidden are going to make, and he says, take them out anyway. Because these people, and only these people, can bring the end of L'man Shmoi for the sake of the Eibishter himself. He brings a slightly different medrash. I think the two medrashim are sort of like, they support each other. It's one medrash after the other in the Torah Shlema. He says, Vayad, he sees how much trouble they're going to make. They're going to rebel against the Eibush at the Yam Suf. Hashem takes them out of Mitzrayim, gives 10 makas to Egypt. The firstborn died, Chatzos Laila. They bring a carbon Pesach. They all walk out of Egypt. Within a week, they're protesting and complaining. But 15 minutes later, the Yam Suf splits. The Yidden go into the Yam Suf. They look up to the heaven, they see God. They put up their fingers. They're Kelev unveiled. 5 minutes before, they're complaining that they love God. So this is a second method. Vayad, he sees that Yidden complain. Vayed, and he knows that Yidden very quickly do tshuva. They come to see the Eibishter and they correct it. So this second medrash is very similar, or it's sort of like a hemshich to the first medrash, where the Eibishter says, no, these are my people. With all the tzaras they're going to give me, these are my people, because in the end they're going to carry through what I need to carry through. Then you get to more involved pirushim. And these involved pirushim are hard because they don't say it all in the Chumash. The Rabbeinu Hananel, one of the Go'onim, who has a pirush of Chumash that we do not have, but it's been collected from other Sfarim. It was lost. A lot of things were lost, trust me. He writes, Vayara Lakim is Bnei Yisrael. He saw that the Jewish people did tshuva. Vayeda Lakim, and he had Rachmanas on them.
They did tshuva at that time?
They did tshuva at that time, which is interesting. No one knows that pshat. They're in Mitzrayim. Now, what's the story? The story was they were put into Egypt, and you must remember the Jewish people were not Jews. They were Bnei Neach. Right? Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were Jews. They kept 630 mitzvahs. The Shvatim didn't. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Hud, Yisachar, Zvul, Dan, Avtal, Gad, Asher, Yosef, even Yosef and Yamin, they kept 7 mitzvahs Neach. Certainly when they left Israel, they have 7 mitzvahs. Which meant they really had one big mitzvah to keep in Mitzrayim. They shouldn't fall into idol worship. When it comes to Gilad Ois, when it comes to immorality, Rashi says they were pure. Even though they were slaves, and we know how masters treat slaves, every Jewish boy born knew who his father was. There was only one Yid who was a mamzer. In Gilad Ois, Yid was tzaddikim. But Navayt Zara, they fell so low they looked at them with the Egyptians. Mamish, they fell so low. Had the Yid not fallen to Avodah Zarah, when they went out of Mitzrayim, it would have been Mashiach. They fell deep into Avodah Zarah. So according to Rabbi Hananel, at the end of that Golus, they're 85 years into these terrible tzaddis, all of a sudden there was an awakening. And Moshe's not even in Mitzrayim. Moshe's still in Midian. According to this Rabbi Hananel, there was an awakening of tshuva. Vayara Lakim as Bnei Yisrael, as much as they're suffering, they got so bad, they had to say to us tshuva. Vayeda Lakim, and the Eibusha said, it's time to have Rachmanas on them. He translated from Das from the word Rachmanas, which I find fascinating. Das, to know, means to have Rachmanas. And this comes up in a number of different Mefarshim as well. There's another Medrash which adds a kvetch to this Rabbi Hananel, which is fascinating. There's a Medrash also says, Vayara Lakim, the Eibusha saw the Yidden do tshuva. But he saw something else. That Yidden did tshuva privately. Every did tshuva by himself. And he didn't know that other Yidden also did tshuva. Vayeda Lakim, the Eibishter knew that every individual Jew did tshuva by himself. Now when you do tshuva alone, and nobody else knows, there's 2 ways to look at it. One way to look at it is that you're embarrassed. You don't want to tell your neighbor you did tshuva because maybe you look like a weirdo, Everybody else is having a good life and you never ruined your life and you did tshuva. The other way to do it, look at it, is that even though I'm doing it all by myself, there's no movement, there's no wave, there's no tumult of tshuva. A Yid as a private citizen does tshuva. It says this, a Medrash, Rabbi Hananel, the Eibishter saw that every Yid did tshuva privately, metanemis. It wasn't a social club. It wasn't a meeting of the minds where everybody got together. There was like a fabring and everyone was inspired. And he did tshuva. Every yochid v'yochad has hated his tshuva. And the Eibishter saw the integrity. Vayari saw that everyone did tshuva privately. Vayeh, they knew the integrity of that personal tshuva. There's an implication that the Eibishter arranged that a Yid should find out that the other Yid also did tshuva, to encourage them. So according to this Pirush, the pasuk actually makes sense.
From what?
From idol worship. You have to say, what else was there? In other words, this idea that for 85 years Hashem doesn't see and all of a sudden he sees, the Taretz is, according to this Ben Chanan, this Medrash, there was a change of the Matthias. Yidden did tshuva, and therefore Vayari saw their tshuva, Vayed, and he knew. Then you get the Kabbalah. And I'm going to share with you 2 insights. The first insight is the Ramban. The Ramban is a Pirush on Chumash, who writes in his introduction to Chumash that he's going to explain things al pi Kabbalah. It's the weirdest thing in the world. I'm going to explain the big Kabbalah. He says, but don't even try to understand. I'm going to put secrets that in. Don't even. He's writing it down, saying, don't even try to figure it out. What's the point of writing it down if no one should figure it out? Akash v'maisa. I mean, this many Sfarim written on this Ramban to explain the Kabbalah sections of his Pirush. But he talks about how does Kabbalah explain things. Kabbalah explains things in mystical levels. Right? That's what Kabbalah does. Kabbalah explains things there's where the Eibish's connection to the world is on a higher level, and when the Eibish's connection to the world is on a lower level. For example, you have this even in Tanya, an idea called Gaus HaShechina, that the Eibish himself goes into Gaus. When Yidden go into Gaus, the Eibish goes into Gaus. What is the meaning of Gaus HaShechina? Gaus HaShechina means the Eibish behaves like as if he's trapped. In the times of the Beis HaMikdash, Where does the Shechina sit? It sits in the Mishkan, on the place the Eibishter seat. And when the Eibishter Shechina sits on the Mishkan, so the Eibishter Kedusha, Shechina and Kedusha are two levels. Shechina is the part of Hashem that sits, the Lukus that sits. Kedusha is the Lukus which hovers. When the Shechina sits, the Kedusha hovers. And the time that the Beis HaMikdash is standing, the Mishkan is in its place, and the Shechina sits, and the Kedusha is in its place. When the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, there's a split. The Kedusha goes away completely, and the Shechina gets trapped in Golus with us. So the story of Yidden in Golus Mitzrayim is a story that involves also the Eibishter himself. What happens? For 80 years he doesn't know than he knows. No. For 80 years the Shechina was in Golus. The Golus Shechina means say the Kvayachal, the Eibishter can do whatever he wants. But he wanted to suffer together with the Jewish people in Egypt. And as they suffered, he suffered. And the nature of Hashem's suffering is that Kvayachal, he can't help us with our suffering. Until this moment, the Eibishter hears, and the Eibishter remembers, and the Eibishter knows. The Eibishter hears their crying, and he remembers them. So if you know Kabbalah, and I don't have a lot of time, I'll try to make this as quickly as I can. I have two Pirushim to tell you. Shmiya, hearing, is the lower level. Remembering is the higher level. And Kabbalistically, this is like Malchus and like Zoh, meaning Yidden were in Golus. Hearing means that the Shechina was raised up to its correct place. Remembering means the idea of Zochar, the Eibush Shechina was even higher. And the result of that was, there was a Yediyah, the Eibishter became aware of the Jewish people, and he had Rachmanis on them. You see, what does it take to have mercy on another person? What does it take to have compassion and mercy on another person? If you'll ask the average psychologist, they'll tell you that people who have empathy in other people do it because they're weak. You see another person's pain, it hurts you. You don't want to feel bad, so you feel bad for them, you want to fix it. In other words, there's a good argument to be made that the rachamim, compassion, mercy comes from weakness. If you're a tougher person, you don't let it get to you. But that is compassion that comes from weakness. There is also a compassion that comes from strength. You're a healthy person, and you're a strong person, but you're so healthy and you're so strong that you're able to feel what another person feels. And that's the meaning of the word Vayeda. In Hasidus, the word Das, which means to know to the extent you could feel. Vayara Lakim, the Eibishter saw Yiddish suffering. Vayeda, and he knew when he was margish, the Eibishter felt. Hashem's Rachmanis doesn't come from weakness. Hashem's Rachmanis comes from strength. And that's the Pshat. The Eibishter was in Golus. And when the Shechina is emerging from the Golus, he goes up to the level of Shmiya and the level of Zikaron. Vayar Vayeda translates the Ramban. The Eibishter Kvayachal was on a level where his relationship with the Jewish people, even though he doesn't feel their pain in a way that makes him weak, from the position of Yediyah, from the position of strength, the Eibishter feels the Rachmanis to the Jewish people. This is the Ramban. And then there's a Rikanti. And it'll take me a couple of minutes and I'll let you go. The Rikanti points out, tomorrow morning's Chassidus is going to be late, don't worry, you're going to get your time back and relax. And Mistam in the morning it's more important than it is now, so I'm doing you a favor. He says that it says 4 times Shem Elokim. 4 times Shem Elokim. Vayishma Elokim, Vayisker Elokim, Vayar Elokim, Vayed Elokim. I say 4 times Elokim. So the Rikanti explains that there's 4 levels. Again, Kabbalah always speaks about levels. In other words, when you study the Torah and what's called in English the anthropomorphic, the human-like relationship between the Eibishter and the world, so Kabbalah explains that this anthropomorphism has to do with Hashem's relationship with the world depends on what level it's on. So he says, you know, and I'll say it in a language which is familiar to you, you know Yud Kei Vav Kei. The second Hey is the lowest level, the Vav is the second level, the first Hey is the third level, and the Yud is the highest level. So it's Vayishma Elokim means that Shechina. Shechina means the Hey, the lowest level of Atzilus.
Why is Vayishma?
Because the opposite of Shmiya is the Iyah, and relatively speaking, just like before, Shmiya and Zikaron. In the Ramban spiritual, it's the same thing. The difference between hearing and seeing, or hearing and remembering, one is feminine and one is masculine. So in that context, this is lower, this is higher. Means that the Eibishter comes out of the Eibishter itself was in Golus. And the Eibishter emerges from the Golus to hear. He hears. Means the Eibishter's sense of the Yiddish Tzaris is in the Madreg of Shechina only. Then, Vayisker, he remembers, Elokim remembers. Meaning to say that the Eibishter is sort of raised even further from the Golus. And each time he's raised further from the Golus, his perspective on the Jewish people and their Golus, on the one hand he's further away from them, but on the other hand he's able to be more precise in how he experiences their pain and wants to bring them redemption. Then it says Vayad Elokim, and the E of Vayad he translates this from the word tshuva. This is ancient Kabbalah. We don't speak this way anymore. In ancient Kabbalah, there's feminine, there's masculine, and there's tshuva. Tshuva is bina. Tshuva is higher and ishtalshlus. Bina. So Vayad Elokim he called the level of tshuva, meaning to say that the Eibishter emerges and goes with the madrega of bina. And Vayed Elokim he says Vayed Adam. He reaches the madrega of chochmah. So the Rekanti explains that these psukim are not describing Hashem noticing the Jewish people. These psukim are describing the Eibishter removing himself from the Golus. And the Ramban is saying something quite similar. As the Eibishter removes himself from the Golus, his relationship with the Jewish people changes. He is no longer trapped in Golus with us. When the Eibishter is trapped in Golus with us, he suffers with us. But Kayachal, he can't do anything about it. When he emerges from the Golus, like it says in Parshas Nitzavim, V'shav Hashem Elokecha Shavutcha, the Gemara says, when we go out of Golus, Hashem goes out of Golus with us. The Gemara, Pasuk Mashiach is going to come. V'shav Hashem Elokecha es Shavutcha, Hashem goes out of the Golus together with the Jews. Here you have it in Shmos. But here it happens first the Eibishter goes out of the Golus, and then he takes us out. Vayishma means he goes out of Golus to the Madreg of Shechina. Vayisker means he goes to the Madreg of Zikon, which is higher level. Vayad he calls tshuva, which is above ishtalshlus bina. Vayeda is the madrega of but the Eibishter emerges from the Golus, and the Eibishter's emergence from the Golus gives him kayachal a different relationship with the Yidden in the Golus. The Golus was necessary for a time, but now that the Golus ends, it first ends for the Eibishter kayachal, and as the Eibishter emerges from the Golus, he treats the Yidden who are still in Golus from his place of Geula. And when the Eibishter treats the Yidden in Golus from his place of Geula, automatically their situation changes. It starts to make sense. And when it starts to make sense, the Eibishter takes the Yidden out of Golus. I want to say one thought left. One final, I'm going to stop at this point, okay? I want to tell you something. And this is an interesting thing to consider as a philosophy and even as a truth. The Eibishter has a weakness for suffering. All over the world, forget the Jews, take the Jews out of the picture. When people suffer, the Eibishter turns. When there's a dominator and a dominated, when there's a powerful and there's a subordinate who suffers at the hands of the dominated, it doesn't kill him. The Eibishter has Rachmanis, it's his nature. The Eibishter can do whatever he wants, but the Eibishter set up his world where people suffer, he makes the suffering end. Now what happens next? So the person who was enslaving now becomes a slave. The person who was enslaved now becomes free. What happens? The roles are reversed. The person who suffered yesterday is inflicting suffering on the next guy, and the person who yesterday was making you suffer is suffering himself, and the Eibishter Rachmanis also turns. That's how the Eibishter operates. The Eibishter has a weakness for people who suffer. The Jews are different because Hashem's relationship with us, there's no question, the Eibishter is biased. The Eibishter's relationship with the Jews is not fair. He tells it straight. It's not fair. I like him. Not because of them, because of the Avos Eilim. Whatever the reason, Hashem likes us. But we have a similar phenomenon. That the Eibishter turns to the Jews when they suffer gefelich. When their life becomes a little bit better. And usually what happens to Jews when life becomes better, we become, not so interested in the Eibishter anymore. And the famous story, right, if you give me a parking spot, I'll daven tomorrow. Forget it, I found the spot by myself. Everybody knows that story. It's happened 1,000,000 times in 1,000,000 homes every single day of our lives. Yeah? The idea ultimately is that the Yidden should stop suffering, and it shouldn't change the Eibishter's favoritism towards them. Yidden Mitzrayim suffered, and the Eibishter's reaction to their suffering, and he's reacting to their suffering because he's taken them out of suffering. Then they went out of Mitzrayim, and there's a cycle. We get too rich and too powerful, and boom, and then we suffer again. And weiter Rachmanis. The goal is, the end of the game is, that the Jewish people should learn the lesson that it's not only that when we're bad and we're punished, and we're suffering, the Eibush has Rachmanis, and God forbid we get comfortable, we get rich, and we get strong and powerful, and we forget about the Eibush, and then when suffering begins again. No, the goal has to be, there has to be an inherent, a constant state of Ayeda. That Hashem's relationship with Yidden should always be that He knows us and He feels us with a feeling of Rachmanis, not only when we're suffering, even when life is good. Because we're suffering in our relationship with Eibush. There's our humility before our Kodesh Baruch Hu. And that's the end game. In Mitzrayim, Vayishma, Lakim es Nakosim. They're suffering. In our history, if you know the story of the story of the Malachim, even the worst kings of Yisrael, when it got unbearable, Hashem made a nes. Hashem made nisa for Yidden, even they didn't deserve it at all, it got very, very bad. The goal is that there's no suffering, but by a Yid, there is the leiv nishvadik in the presence of Hashem. We have a pneumias suffering, not suffering from pain or want or hunger or fear, but suffering from our relationship with the Eibishter, and the Rachmanos, the Eibishter, remains indefinite. The ultimate Vayeda Elokim. A good Tanakh, thanks for listening.